On the night of August 21st, 1935, Benny Goodman walked onto the stage of the Palomar Ballroom in Los Angeles and played the music that would change his career and his reputation and, in the telling of it afterward, the history of American popular music. The night did not begin well. Goodman's band had been on a cross-country tour that had been marked by mixed receptions and scattered crowds, and the specific discouragement of a musician who believes in what he is playing but cannot find the audience for it. The Palomar was one of the last stops. The band opened with conservative arrangements, the kind of music that had been failing to connect for weeks. And then, late in the evening, Goodman decided to play what he actually wanted to play. The full arrangements, the hot, swinging style that his band had been built around, the kind of music that had not been working in the earlier stops, but that was, in Goodman's own conviction, the thing the band did best. The room erupted. The young audience, teenagers and dancers and people who had been waiting, without quite knowing they were waiting, for this particular sound at this particular moment, responded with the specific energy of an audience that has just heard something it needed to hear. The press had a name for it within weeks: King of Swing. A title, a crown, a specific attribution that placed Benny Goodman at the center of the swing era and made the summer of 1935 the moment when swing began. Louis Armstrong had been playing swing since 1920, 15 years before the Palomar. Louis Armstrong and Benny Goodman knew each other. This was not a rivalry conducted at a distance through newspaper columns and competing press releases. These were musicians who inhabited the same professional world and who had, on various occasions and in various configurations, been in the same room making music. What Armstrong said about Goodman publicly was characteristically gracious. He did not contest the title of King of Swing in the manner of a man who felt aggrieved at having been passed over. He was not the kind of musician who positioned himself in relation to institutional recognition and the specific commercial apparatus that had built up around Goodman's success, with its teen audiences and its press campaigns, was not a category Armstrong was interested in competing within. What Armstrong was precise about, and what the musicians who knew him and talked to him in those years confirmed, was the music itself. He was precise about what the music was, and where it had come from, and what it required of the musicians who played it. He was precise about who had been playing it, and for how long. He was not imprecise about this out of modesty. He was direct about it in the way that a craftsman is direct about the history of his craft. Goodman, for his part, understood Armstrong's place in the history of the music he played. He was not a musician who was unaware of his own influences. He knew what the Hot Fives had meant. He knew what Armstrong's recordings had done to what jazz musicians understood to be possible. He knew what had been there before the Palomar. When the two men were on stage together, which happened at various points across their careers, what the room got was not a comparison. It was two musicians playing the same music with the specific qualities each of them brought to it. Goodman's clarinet, precise and brilliant. Armstrong's trumpet, warm and direct and pitched at a range that made everything around it feel like it was happening in relation to Armstrong. Armstrong didn't need the title. The music was his argument. And the music had been making that argument since 1920. The music that Benny Goodman played at the Palomar Ballroom in 1935, the hot, rhythmically driving, soloist-forward style that the press christened swing, and that the decade made into the dominant form of American popular music had roots that were specific and traceable, and that led, if you trace them, back to New Orleans and Chicago and the recordings that Louis Armstrong had made in the 1920s. The Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings, made between 1925 and 1928, had demonstrated the possibility of small combo jazz organized around the soloist, with a rhythmic drive and improvisational freedom that had not been fully articulated on record before Armstrong. The recordings had moved through the jazz world with the speed of something that changes what musicians understand to be possible. Other musicians heard them, heard what Armstrong was doing with the trumpet and with the rhythmic framework of the ensemble, and revised their own understanding of what the music could do. What the music could do, in Armstrong's hands, and in the hands of the musicians who heard him, was swing. Not as a formal category with a marketing campaign, but as a quality of music, the specific rhythmic displacement, the forward momentum, the interplay between the soloist and the rhythm section that made the music feel like it was pulling the listener forward through time, rather than simply occurring in it. This was what Armstrong had been doing since the early 1920s. By 1935, when Benny Goodman walked onto the Palomar stage, Armstrong had been doing it for 15 years. He had recorded it, performed it, taken it to Europe, brought it back, and made it the foundation of everything he played. The question was not whether Armstrong had built the form. The question was, what happened when the music industry in 1935 decided to name the form, and who it named the form after? The industry named it after Benny Goodman. And Armstrong, who had been watching from the inside for 15 years, understood exactly what had happened. The swing era lasted approximately a decade, from the mid-1930s to the mid-1940s, when the economics and musical fashions that had sustained it shifted, and the era gave way to bebop and rhythm and blues, and the various directions that American popular music took after the war. In the conventional telling of it, the swing era begins at the Palomar in 1935 and is organized around figures like Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, and Glenn Miller, band leaders whose commercial success and mainstream visibility made them the faces of the era in the press and in the cultural memory. But the musicians who played in the swing era knew what they were playing and where it came from. They knew whose recordings had built the floor they were dancing on. They knew what the Hot Fives meant to what was possible in the music, and what Armstrong's 15 years before the Palomar had established as the baseline from which the era had grown. Armstrong, in the 1930s and 40s, was not outside the swing era. He was playing swing, recording swing, performing in the same venues and for the same audiences and with many of the same musicians. He was simply not the face the era was organized around, for reasons that were specific to the music industry of the 1930s and that had nothing to do with who had been doing the work. The history of American music is full of this pattern. The person who builds the foundation and the person who receives the credit for the building are not always the same person. Armstrong understood this. He navigated it without bitterness, with the specific equanimity of a man who knows the work is in the music and that the music is the record. On August 21st, 1935, they called Benny Goodman King of Swing. Louis Armstrong had been playing swing for 15 years. He did not contest the title. He had the music. He had always had the music. The music was his argument. It still is.